for today's program. I am Lesroy Williams. Of course, your company is appreciated from week to week. Today, we are going to be having a discussion on the weather and the climate. And I have with me officials from the St. Kitts Meteorological Office in St. Kitts. I have with me Mr. Elmer Burke, who is the Senior Met Officer, and I have Mr. Ray John, who is a former Met Officer and who is well known throughout the Federation as a meteorologist. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The Met Services, it is my understanding, is celebrating 50 years. 50 years of its foundation in St. Kitts. And under the theme, service with accuracy and reliability, St. Kitts Meteorological Service at 50. Of course, we know that the climate and weather are very impactful on the lives of human beings. All living things, rather, are impacted by the weather and climate. So much of our lives and livelihoods depend upon weather and climate. The rain, when it rains, the sunshine, the wind. We have hurricanes, we have floods, we have droughts. All of this having to do with the atmosphere and its phenomena, the atmospheric conditions, the weather of an area, and how it really impacts people, how it really impacts all living things. It impacts culture. If it rains, of course, we know that it's very good for the farmers, that they need water for their crops. We need water to drink. We need water for hygienic purposes, and so on. The sun. Crops need sunlight. We need sunlight. And so therefore, the weather and the study of the weather and all of that is particularly important. And of course, again, when we have too much rain, we have floods. When we have too little rain, we have droughts. When we have a lot of a convectional activity taking place, and so on, we have hurricanes and all of that sort of a thing within a particular time of the year. So, and then of course we don't have snow. You hear about blizzards and you hear about all of that sort of a thing. And tornadoes and all of that. All of that has to do with the weather and the climate. Today we are hearing a lot about climate change and how, that is impacting weather patterns and so on. Today we are going to hear firstly from Dr. Arlene Lang, who is the coordinating director of the Caribbean Meteorological Organization, CMO. And she has some congratulatory remarks which we wish to play for the audience, congratulating the St. Kitts Meteorological Office on its 50 years.
Service so many years ago represents a really forward step
in applying science in service to society, essentially contributing to the socio-economic development of your people by providing on a daily basis information that helps with economic development through services to aviation, maritime customers, disaster risk management, agriculture, water resource management, public health, energy, tourism, and other sectors. The advances that you have made in monitoring the weather have helped to improve weather forecasts and warnings that have saved lives, livelihood, and property, especially during extreme weather events. Over time, the importance of the St. Kitts Meteorological Service has only grown as your nation and the Caribbean has faced the challenges of major hurricanes, severe drought, climate variability, and climate change. The St. Kitts Meteorological Service has been a national repository for collecting, preserving, and analyzing observations that then inform decisions by weather and climate sensitive sectors. Through the decades, your technicians have maintained records that illustrate the changing Caribbean climate, and that information has been valuable for guiding climate adaptation measures by the government, public sector, businesses, and the general public. The potential impacts of changes in climate, especially with regard to hazards such as hurricanes, droughts, coastal inundation, and erosion, warrants the efforts that are being made to build, maintain, and strengthen the meteorological services in St. Kitts and Nevis. The CMO headquarters is contributing to those efforts by developing a strategic plan for the National Meteorological Service, including a national framework for weather, water, and climate services, and a complementary action plan. We're also helping to develop meteorological policy and the template meteorological bill to ensure that you have the legal mandate for your services. The CMO really has a special connection with St. Kitts and Nevis, as the agreement to establish the CMO was signed in Basseterre in October 1973. St. Kitts and Nevis has since hosted sessions of the Caribbean Meteorological Council, which is the governing ministerial body of the CMO, in 2004 and most recently in 2018, which I was very pleased to attend on my very first trip to St. Kitts. The Caribbean Meteorological Organization headquarters unit is therefore elated to be a part of this special celebration and wishes the Meteorological Service continuing strength and growth over the next 50 years and beyond.
Okay, welcome back to Working for You, and that was an address by Dr. Arlene Lang, who is the coordinating director of the Caribbean Meteorological Organization, congratulating the St. Kitts Meteorological Office on its 50-year anniversary. Thank you very much, Dr. Lang. Now, the team that is chosen for the 50th anniversary is Service with Accuracy and Reliability, St. Kitts Meteorological Service at 50. Now, what is the importance of this team? There are some keywords in it, of course: accuracy and reliability.
I'm happy that you would have mentioned the theme, Leslie. Um, One of some of the core tenets in terms of the mandate of the Met Office is to provide accurate information to the general public, because the general public, as well as all of our stakeholders, require as accurate as possible information so that they can make timely intervention and to save lives and livelihoods. Also, the information must be reliable. Persons must have a level of confidence in the information that we're going to be sharing with them, because we are the authoritative source for weather here in St. Kitts and Nevis. And such, we coined this based on our mission statements and everything, because we recognize that we need to ensure that we continue to provide service with accuracy and reliability, while even though we're marking our 50th anniversary, because if you don't do that, you will become obsolete and you won't become relevant anymore. Persons would now find an alternate source to get their weather information and try to make decisions based on what we call a foreign source, which is very dangerous at times.
Right. Now, Mr. John.
Well, I would just like to add a small part to that, which over the years has become very pronounced. And it's not just reliability, but it encapsulates the whole idea of sustainability and always be the authentic source. You don't want to be the leader of nothing. You want to be the authentic authority with respect to the weather. So I just want to throw that in.
Okay, so you're chewing that term, sustainability, which is important. So accuracy, reliability, and sustainability.
Absolutely.
Right, so the 50 years is a half of a century. And in those 50 years, the St. Kitts, I refer to it as the Met Office for short, has evolved. It is not the same as when it started. There has been development at the Met Office. Now, Mr. John, what have been some of those developments over the time that you were a Met officer or head of that department?
To begin with, we had to learn to come to grips with government's policy because it was set up not in a vacuum. The British Overseas Development had decided they were going to get rid of the islands just before statehood. And so they had this arrangement where internationally radio used to run the airport and the Met offices and those kinds of things. And what basically happened was we were taught not just meteorology in a general sense, but more aviation meteorology than anything else. And so it was solely directed towards hourly observations, 3-hourly synoptic observations, and those kinds of things. Those have changed. And they've changed out of necessity, computerized, digital, whatever have you. I have seen that over the years taken on a completely new different role, where numbers mean more than what we had them to be back then. 1,000 feet was 1,000 feet. Now you have to make sure it has metric component. So you can speak in double language and that kind of stuff. These are some of the subtle changes that have happened over the years, and they have made the Met Office, again, the more authentic, substantive thing that it is in terms of its role in aviation and in weather forecasting.
Right, so you're saying that one of the developments over the years has been that of improvements in technology.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And technology has brought the Met Office up to date with current trends that are happening in terms of the weather and so on. It's easier to get data and all of that because of the technology, Elmo?
Yes, it is. Also, to add to what Rejan would have indicated, a part of the transformation, as I would like to coin it, also would look at in terms of the mandate, because Rejan rightfully indicated that when the Met Services was established initially, our primary role was aviation meteorology. So that's all we were basically doing, just providing weather information for the aviation sector. However, over the years, we have evolved. We have now been providing weather information for various key sectors, whether it be the disaster fraternity, the general public, agriculture, health, water, you name it, tourism, because everybody is impacted, as you said earlier in your introduction, by weather as well as climate. And there's a sort of difference between weather and climate, and I guess we'll discuss it a little as we go further into the thing. Also, as a part of the transformation, we would have recognized that for us to move from 1971 to 2021, we would have had to invest, whether it be here nationally from the national budget or through SCASPA or through various projects. We had to invest in terms of the infrastructure because we needed to keep up with the technology, because we having the updated information but operating on an obsolete system makes no sense. So as such, the Met Office have evolved where we have invested quite heavily in terms of infrastructural upgrade. At the same time, having good equipment, good technology and so forth, but not having the capacity in terms of the human capacity to interpret the readout or the information that these modern equipment would provide makes no sense as well. And as such, we also coupled it where we invested heavily with human staff capacity development and so forth. So from over the years, I know prior to my coming into the Med Services, I know we would have had one forecaster prior to me. Since then, we are now at 3 current forecasters. 2 of us have attained our bachelor's, so we are full meteorologists. One of the officer is now undergoing his forecasting, so that's the practical component. So you find we are really investing heavily in terms of human capacity. At the same time, we recognize that yes, our mandate, our key mandate is the aviation meteorology. So all of our officers have done aviation meteorology. But what we have now been doing is we advancing some of the officers. So for example, we have persons who are now trained to maintain our equipment, because that is becoming necessary.
Yes.
Because having the equipment and nobody to maintain them makes no sense. Also, you need somebody to be able to process the data. So, have from the climatological component. So we have persons who are trained in statistics and climatology. So we are advancing the staff along with the technology as well as the mandate evolve. And officially, even though there isn't a written mandate, as more and more is being asked of us from the general public, from our stakeholders, we step forward and we step up and we try to produce. So we get the particular skill set that is necessary for us to provide the general public, our various stakeholders, with the information and the products and services that they require.
I suppose that weather forecasting is not an easy thing. And as you correctly said previously, it requires accuracy and reliability. Because if those, and sustainability, if those things are not involved, it can spell disaster for people.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Because of course you know that we have to pay attention to the weather to know how to adapt and how to behave and how to prepare for any sort of weather calamity that may come our way. And for example, if the seas are rough or they're going to be rough, and that information is not made, first it's not interpreted correctly, the data, and it is not made available, which is the communication dimension, to the public, then that can spell disaster for seafarers, for sea vessels, for people who dive and people who go to the beach and all of that sort of a thing. So that accuracy, that reliability, that sustainability, they are important components of weather forecasting. Now, weather forecasting is a process. Can you outline what that process is? The process of weather forecasting.
I'm happy that you asked that, because persons need to recognize that it's quite complicated. But
It's not, for example, people might think, oh, you're just pulling a rabbit out of a hat.
Oh, no, it's not.
or that it is some you're reading the stars, or maybe it's horoscopes, or it's
Let's just call it rocket science.
it is rocket science, or it is some sort of superstition, or what is the process? Because I mean, you're dealing here, of course, with predictability as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes, people always say, oh, it's going to rain, and it really doesn't rain. Or sometimes you look up at the sky and you see a lot of dark clouds and so on, and you say, but I thought it was going to rain, but no rain came. So let us hear about the process.
Okay. Okay, let's start off with what's a forecast. A forecast is just basically a prediction what the weather condition is likely to be at a particular time and a particular place.
Based on
And
the current
you recognize that I'm saying it's time sensitive and place specific. What we do as forecasters, we assess the current conditions, because you need to know what's going on at the time. At the same time, we use a lot of our technology, and we use what we call numerical weather models. Those are basically programs that try to model the weather in terms of the atmospheric conditions, what it was then at a particular time and place, what it is now, and based on quite a bit of dynamics and calculations, try to do a projection what it is likely to be. The models would give us an idea of what is likely to be. We as the forecaster, that's where the human component comes in. We now have to assess the output of the model to say, okay, are we seeing a bias? Is it overperforming on a particular parameter? Because, for example, some models would overshoot in terms of the rainfall estimate, some overshoot in terms of how strong the winds are going to be. So these little biases you have to really understand and appreciate for when you're going to be doing your forecast. So you're taking all of this information, and we're not talking about just one model output. We're talking about, in some instances, up to 5 model outputs, just for a simple location as St. Kitts and Nevis. So we're assessing all of these variables in terms of whether you're looking at the winds, the temperature, the pressure, the rainfall likelihood, and all of these information, and we're trying to come up with a storyline. What is the weather likely to be during the next forecast period that we're looking at? And the forecast period, sometimes it can be at a short time, so sometimes it can be for the next 3 hours, 6 hours, or whatever, you know what I mean? So we try to do that. So it's a description of what it is likely to be. Persons have a tendency to say that the weather forecast was wrong, and I always argue against that. And the reason I say that is, yes, the information didn't pan out in terms of what we forecast didn't play out in reality, but based on the information that we had at the time, that was the best and the most accurate information in terms of output or the outcome that we anticipate. So it's a predictability, a projection. So based on the information we had, this is what we are projecting it to be. 6 hours, 12 hours down the line. Within that 6-hour time span, things can change. And as such, you recognize it is very important for us as forecasters to keep updating the information, because we can't just be static. We have to be dynamic, because all of these fluxes in the weather gonna have changes in terms of the output in terms of down the line. And as such, we have to be adjusting our forecast, not to cover our tail, but to adjust to any changes that might have happened that the models or we didn't pick up initially.
Right, so weather is something that is constantly changing.
Yes, it is.
And so therefore, because it's constantly changing, you basically have to be observing and forecasting and communicating the changes that are taking place in weather that requires that accuracy, reliability, and Mr. John, you spoke about the sustainability. I often say that it's a prediction.
Yes, it is.
It's predictability with some accuracy and some reliability, of course, but those are human qualities. and human element come into play. But I always say that God, God is the great meteorologist. The ultimate. He knows what the meteorologist does not even know. So that is why I say sometimes when they forecast one thing and then God show them it is something else. So what do you do? So I mean, ultimately, he knows the weather. He is responsible and in control of it, the oceans and the planets and all living things and so on, and how those things are synchronized and all of that sort of a thing.
At the same time, you must remember, God empowers.
Of course, and that I am agreeing with.
So he empowers.
That I am agreeing with. But what the point that I was, that is correct. The point that I was trying to make is in support of meteorologists to basically say that yes, we use our human knowledge and we use all of that, but at the very same time, sometimes things that
happen.
we predict
Doesn't happen.
does not happen.
And it has happened.
And does.
And has happened.
And also has happened. So that is what that is what I am trying to point out. Not to
but just to add, that's why it is always important that we as forecasters, meteorologists, or even Met officers, we provide that level of monitoring and reporting, because you have to report when there are these fluxes or these changes, because these changes can be for the better. So you have an improvement of conditions or a worsening of conditions, because remember, persons' life and livelihoods are dependent on up-to-date information. So you can't use information from yesterday and tell persons, go and live your life based on the weather information that we put out yesterday. Because look at it, for the day, we already put out 2 forecasts. So you have to use the most up-to-date information as possible to make your decisions.
Right.
Well, just to add to the reality of what you're talking about, visit the Met Office in Atlanta, and I go there, and these guys would have an additional app or 2 that is purely with M&E. They just keep measuring and evaluating, measuring as a direct component of the parameters that are visible. And they just keep measuring and evaluating and measuring. And you find in the US, they can actually narrow it down to the county, and they have that ability simply because the M&E component that was never even existent before. We just went on the parameters and what is and what isn't, and what we know of how it affects the country. But they have used these measuring indicators and evaluating indicators to substantiate that the models work.
Right, and you spoke about certain things. For example, you spoke about the speed of the wind, you spoke about atmospheric pressure, you spoke about temperature, you spoke about all of that. Now, what are some of the equipment that you use to measure those things?
When we actually started first, there were only 4 pieces of equipment. We had a basic thermometer, and we would put a little gauze around one of the thermometers to make it a wet bulb thermometer. And so we made our own kind of instruments. Then you had a basic would be a anemometer, which would be a natural thing. Wind and temperatures seem to always follow one another. Most important, because it was aviation meteorology back then, the barometer played a very significant part because planes fly on pressure pattern systems. And so you had a normal Q pattern, there are different types of barometers, and we had ours and so on. We had a Campbell-Stokes that measures the sunshine. And so those are the 4 pieces of equipment, and of course we had a rain gauge. So we really had 5 pieces of equipment when we started. Look at the difference today. Today we can add pieces and pieces and more pieces.
So, Mr. Burke, what are some of the differences today?
For us here in St. Kitts and Nevis, we use basically the same set of equipment. However, they have been upgraded. So you move from an analog type of equipment
To digital.
to more digital.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because you need the information in real time and at a fast pace. Also, one of the equipment Regan probably forgot to mention was the human component, the human person.
Yeah.
Because you as a human, you as an observer, you have to go out and observe the other elements. Because there are some elements that you don't have a
Inside.
particular instrument to actually go and measure. So your eyes become a part of an instrument.
Yes.
Yes, ears and everything. You know what I mean? All your different senses come together to make this true picture of what is the condition at the site.
Right. So for example, you have all of that equipment, and one of the first orders of business for you, I suppose, is to be familiar with what is currently happening in the weather.
Absolutely.
So, do you look at satellite imagery, for example? Do you surface data, precipitation reports, and do you get a briefing as well from other forecasters on duty?
Because of our limited staffing situation here in St. Kitts and Nevis, the observers are required to brief each other in terms of what is the expected forecast based on the forecast. What is, if there's any major current weather condition, to at least alert them. You know what I mean? As a meteorologist, for example, like as a part of my training, when I did my training in Antigua, which is a forecasting office, you now had that level of handover, or you know what I mean, succession, as you have a change in shift, because you need to brief your incoming colleague as to what is the current condition, what you're seeing, what you're monitoring, so that when they now go and do their analysis, they start to look for these particular features to see whether it is holding. Because what we try to do as much as possible as meteorologists, forecasters, we look for trends, and we look to see whether or not the trends are holding, and that will guide our forecast. So it is very important for the incoming and the outgoing forecasters or observers to brief each other in terms of what is the current condition, what features is driving the weather condition at the time.
Right. No, you can look at short range, of course, forecasting, as if you said, well, the daily forecast. But you can also, I realize now sometimes the office puts out a 3-day forecast.
Yes.
What is your capacity, for example, to put out a 7-day forecast or a 14-day forecast?
We do have the capacity. However, at the same time, what we always try to tell persons, the further out you go in terms of a forecast, the less accurate it's gonna be, because you're gonna be basically absorbing more fluxes and variabilities in terms of what the outcome could be, and as such the reliability drops. So on a short timeline, a forecast is most of the time is have a higher percentage of accuracy, but as you go further out in timeline, as I said, you're moving from a few hours or a day, and you're now moving into 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, then the level of accuracy, especially depending on the particular parameter, reduces.
Okay, so the level of accuracy reduces, but at the very same time, sometimes when you have the longer range forecasting as opposed to the shorter range forecasting, the longer range forecasting can help you to prepare more in terms of any eventuality in terms of the weather. For example, today is Wednesday, and if I'm told, well, Sunday that there is going to be a blizzard in Minnesota, for example, people will know how to prepare and travel and all of that sort of thing, you know, comes into play. If I'm going to St. Paul's, Minnesota, for example, and there's going to be a blizzard, then I will know, well, look, I have my flight set for such and such a time, and so therefore I will have to change it, because, I mean, I can't go because the airport might be closed and all of that sort of a thing. So it can give people a level of planning. The longer range thing, rather than the daily thing is important, the short day-to-day thing is important, but that is the point I was getting at.
Yes, and I agree with you. The long-term forecast allows for long-term planning. However, at the same time, we always encourage end users, do not take a long-term forecast as goal, as this is how it's definitely gonna be. Because if there's any change between the initiation of your forecast and the timeline that you expect it, that can throw off the entire forecast. And as such, that's why we always tell persons, keep up to date, because the forecasting office or the Met Office will provide these periodic updates, because you need to capture all of these fluxes, because these changes or the fluxes, as I indicated, can affect your long-term forecast. And as such, we need to monitor them. So yes, it can allow you to do a long-term projection and planning. However, we always tell persons, do not put all your eggs in a basket based on a long-term forecast. It's better when you're looking at a few days out versus a few weeks out.
It has its place. And again, to be real, and for youngsters who are listening who maybe want to look at careers, for example, it works. But there's that level of liability that's built into long-range forecasts. Even Dr. whatever his name is, the forecast is out for the hurricane season. How much to expect, what to expect. But he has an obligation as well to update, and you'll get a next update again at the end of, before the end of June, before the hurricane season really gets going. And so they do that, as compared to, let's say, a commercial meteorologist. A guy gets good money, and he goes out and he's employed by the Los Angeles Lakers, and he goes to the grounds, and he sits on the ground, and he gets all the information that's provided around the ground and makes a forecast. And if it's going to be a beastly hot day, the beer brewers know to brew more beer, so they will sell more beer, and so on. So there's that commercialized thing that goes along. It happens quite often in Australia, where cricket is concerned. Cricket meteorologists, these guys are well paid. But again, it's not for the want of money, while it is. But at the same time, there's the principles involved in updating and the responsibility of being not liable when you know full well it is a forecast. Even if you tell people it's a forecast, they're liable to take it and use it for the wrong reasons. And so these things, we take them into consideration, as well as the principles involved. They have built-in components of consistency, of reliability, the same word that we've been playing around.
Yes, the weather is such a thing, such a phenomena, that it can impact greatly the economy.
Easily.
Greatly impact the economy. And we know that.
Yes, we do.
From storms to hurricanes and so on, and the damage that they can do. Not only that, farmers, if they're not getting enough rain and you're not getting enough sunlight and so on, their crops wouldn't grow. Their crops would be stunted. That then becomes a problem for their livelihood. The fishermen depend a lot on the weather. So there are some people who always have their radios on and are very much tuned in to the weather because their lives depend on it. If the sea is a particular way, you can't have fishermen going out to fish because the seas are rough and they cannot go diving and all of that sort of a thing. So that impacts them. And the forecasting then becomes so important because there are people whose lives depend on this forecasting. They're waiting to see, when can I plant my crops? When can I go fishing? Our culture, is it a good day for the beach? To go for picnic? Is it a good day to go swimming? And things like that. Is Is it a good? I'm going to get some rain today, so my garden will get some water. The wind, for example, how is it going to impact me? Is it going to blow trees down? You know, so there are so many things that we can connect to the economy and our whole social life depends really on the weather. How we dress, for example. Do I have to put on a raincoat? If I'm in a colder climate and so on, I have to wear a sweater. And all of those things impact upon the culture of a place.
Not only that, Leslie, but even from energy consumption, because energy companies especially rely heavily on weather and weather forecasts as well as weather climatology. Because, for example,
renewable energy.
Yes, let's look
the
at
wind,
the sun.
The sun.
Because you need to know, okay, is it gonna be a period of overcast condition? So your solar cells are not gonna be charged as
Fully
much.
charged.
Is it that you, even when you're looking at siting of a solar farm or even a wind farm, you have to now factor in all that information in terms of from the climatology, and that's why we're looking at the difference between weather and climate. Because if I'm gonna site a wind farm, I need to know what the winds are likely to be in that particular area over a period of time. Because on a day-to-day you would have changes, but when you're now looking at it over a long-term period of years, 20, 30 years, whatever little flux is, you know what I mean, normally just taper off. And as such, that's why we normally do the difference between weather and climate.
So what's the difference between weather and climate? You keep saying the difference between weather and... So what is the difference between weather and climate?
Okay, I'm happy that you asked.
That's clear.
Put simply, weather is the short-term description of the atmospheric conditions
Around you.
at a particular time and place. And you're looking at, as you remember, short-term. So you're looking at from a few minutes to a few days or even a few weeks. But when you now start to go into years or decades, then you now start to go into the climate realm. So when we start to talk about climatology, you'll hear us talking about 15 years if you're looking at the temperature, or if you're doing rainfall, we're doing it at what is the average rainfall for a particular place over 30 years.
Yeah, so you're looking at patterns.
Patterns.
It is.
You're looking
Basically,
at basically patterns. So you're looking at the pattern over a span, a span of time, a span of years, and so on. And that is how the climate for a particular area is really determined.
Yes.
So it is weather over a long term, looking at the patterns, and so therefore one can say that this is the climate of a particular area. Now, what is meant, Mr. John? Because we're hearing a lot of that now, and there has been some study that has been done, and you know, just the other day, the President of the United States, Joseph Biden, had this World Conference on the climate, and to see how important that the climate is and its impact. And they're talking about climate change and all of that sort of a thing. What do we mean when we speak about climate change? Because, I mean, the weather is always changing. Today it might be sunny, tomorrow it's rainy. Yesterday it was windy. Today it's not windy. And so on. So the weather is always changing. But when we hear about climate change, what is being referred to?
Put simply, and if you just rearrange the words, a change in climate, a change in the long-term averaging of the weather condition.
Right.
So what we're now looking at is over, for example, if we're looking at a particular parameter, we might have been averaging it over a 30-year period to say, okay, what is the climate like during a 30-year period? But then when you now move into a new decade, you want to know, is the trend holding as you move from that particular climatological period into a next time climatological period? So for example, Previously, when we had the last climatological period, especially when it comes to storms, we used to use data from 1981 to 2010. That was the 30-year period that we were looking at. Because we are now in 2021, we are now shift into a new decade. And as such, we now have to now recalibrate our climatologies. So the new climatological period is now 1991 to 2020. So you find all Met services across the region, across the globe, will be recalculating their climatology, because what they want to see is whether or not you have the shift, or if there's any trend changing from the 1981 to 2010, if that is holding, or if there's any deviation into the new decade, the last decade. So that's basically climate change, put simply.
Right.
You're looking at
There's a
changes.
part of it that I don't want us to miss, that construction, technology, livelihoods and everything also play a big part in climate change. The more concrete jungle you put up, the more the terrestrial radiation is affected, and so the temperatures are not going to be the same because you have more concrete in that particular. And so urbanization and those kinds of things have made a difference.
And
a lot of people are not even touching those subjects.
the greenhouse
The greenhouse effect.
greenhouse effect,
Exactly.
the emissions
Exactly.
that really are, they say, creating global warming,
Right.
a warming of the globe, and the evidence that is being produced for that is that you see in some places like the Arctic or Antarctica, you have these last glaciers and so on that
melting.
are actually melting.
Actually, just
when you-
yesterday I was reading about
No, the very fact that they are going to melt, Mr. John, these huge glaciers, creates another problem. The problem of the ocean rising.
yes.
Okay, I'm happy that you brought up that. Because what you have to factor in is, where are these glaciers? Are they already submerged in water, or partially submerged?
above water.
Because think of it this way: if you have a ice cube in a half a glass of water and it melts, the change in the height of the level of water is minuscule. However, if you have a glass of water and you now introduce a ice cube into that glass of water, the change is more significant and more pronounced. And what we always tell persons, ice melting from land cause more in terms of sea level rise than ice melting that was already in the water. So it's the glacier that is on land, in terms of the permafrost and so forth, melting from the land, which is causing a more significant rise than the submerged or partially submerged glaciers in the water.
Okay.
Yeah, I was saying a similar story to that. In Norway, I was looking at it the day before yesterday, where the mountains and the tributaries come down, and all it is just run off from the ice on the top of the mountain. Nothing to do with ice in the water and glacier and anything else. And they were claiming that the rate of flow was definitely being seen on some of the markings that they put down in some of these tributaries to measure the rise in the tributary towards the main river, and how the river now, the expansion level now is going to have to be more forecast, will have to be given now, because people are now going to be threatened because of the rise in the stream flow into the river.
Right.
Just to add to what Regent was indicating, when you now start to look at the net effect, it is not so much, yes, the sea level is going to rise because you have the expansion and so forth.
Yes.
It's more than that.
But it's the domino effect.
Yeah.
Because what you're now doing is you're adding significant amount of fresh water into a salty environment.
Yes.
So you're diluting the salt. And persons need to recognize that the salt water allows for us to have the natural ocean currents. So you have the ocean current transfer heat from the equator northward, because if
And
not,
southward,
the
yeah.
equator area would be excessively hot. So you have that exchange of heat and coolness and so forth. So when you're now introducing all that additional fresh water, you're slowing down that current. And as such, we here in the equator gonna see an increase in temperature. So it's just a whole domino malefic.
A domino malefic, because
Yes.
some of those countries that are contributing so much to climate change, they are not impacted as much by the climate change. And a lot of these small island developing states
Yes.
are greatly impacted, even though they are not contributing
Contributing much.
significantly to the climate changing
Same with
because of
emissions.
greenhouse emissions, gases, and all of that sort of a thing. But we are seeing, of course, in some places you're having droughts, in other places you're having floods, in other places you're seeing storms that are much more severe, and so on. So there's definitely something happening in terms of the climate. There are some people who don't believe in it. There's some people who think basically it is superstition. I don't want to refer to one president, but I mean, you know,
What the president should have recognized is energy is just transformed from one phase to the next, or transported. And you rightfully said it. We recognize that when we have in one particular area that is experiencing severe drought, on the flip side, somebody else is now going to be experiencing the opposite.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because you have to have this transport of the extra.
Balance,
You know what I
God's
mean?
balance.
a balance.
God's balance.
God's balance. But we are seeing a lot of these imbalances,
Extreme weather situations.
extreme weather conditions, and so on. For example, sometimes I think it looks like the apocalypse when you see all of these in California, for example, burning,
Yeah, wildfires.
wildfires, and what is really creating that? Somebody says the heat that is creating all of these fires down in Australia again. They have a big problem with all these wildfires. Here in St. Kitts at one time, we used to have a lot of fires burning.
We used to burn
I
the
don't
hills
know
deliberately.
whether it was from the weather or people were setting fires or what's not. People, was it created by the weather?
When I
The
was
heat.
when I was growing up, they had controlled burning.
Slash and burn.
Yeah,
We're doing
yeah,
the slash and burn,
yeah.
clearing the land for agriculture.
that's right.
But
So the question was for me, right?
that question was for you.
To be honest, Leslie, I always ask the same question because there are times that the environmental conditions is not conducive for brush fires. However, you still see a few brush fires popping up, which would indicate that it is man-made. And the reason I said man-made is more man-driven.
Man-induced.
Somebody might have accidentally, because a lot of persons you hear their coal keel burst, or somebody might have discarded a cigarette wantonly, and as such, you know what I mean. So you have that happen. At the same time, yes, we know that some of these bush fires that we would have experienced over the past few years would have been, could have been attributed to the weather.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Right. Now we are going to go to the phone lines. We are going to, just in a minute, talk about the forecast for the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season. But let us open the phone lines. The numbers to call, the local number is 465-25-55. That's the local number. And the international number is 1-718-577-2916. That is 1-718-577-2916. We welcome your calls. Right. Now, what are some of the challenges and the complexities of weather forecasting? Mr. John, what are some of the challenges and complexities of it?
I have to give this one a lot of thinking, simply because experience has taught me to be careful about answering certain questions based on experience. I'll give you the experience first and make a long story short. When I was first into meteorology, one of the things about forecasting I found out was that people with livelihoods had their own means of forecasting. You hear about trumpet bush, and trumpet bush turn over, and when the trumpet bush turn over, it's going to rain. And lo and behold, it rained. And fishermen will tell you about turtle trail. I never seen a turtle trail unless I, go look in turtle eggs. But they had these markers and indicators that they used to use. It's just like Elma was talking about parameters and the variables that we go through in the principle of forecasting. And so I preface that to say that the challenges for forecasts nowadays, to my mind, has become the ability of John Public, for want of a nicer word, not to be outstripped by the information that he keeps getting. Because the information is going to be upgraded, it's going to be coined in different languages, in different whatever have you, but it has outstripped the average man. Because all he knows is rain and fall and sun and hurricane. He's not too much interested in the rest part of it. And that in and of itself is a challenge. Again, from experience, I could remember the hurricane season. We're giving out the hurricane is off wherever it is, off Barbados coming up the road.
Yes.
And a fella can call you on the phone and tell you plain out, listen, but I just see it on the TV and it, so he has another dimension of reference that he's using and total disregard for what the forecaster is trying to prove. And at some point it gets to a situation where you either have to shut down the media, okay, for the want of getting accuracy and reliability out to John Public. And so those, I'm talking again from experience, and based on those experience over the 50 years, these have been real things that have mattered in terms of forecast and forecasting.
Yeah, now how, because we have had, of course, you have different models, forecasting models, and sometimes they may seem...
about 70 of them.
Right, and sometimes they seem conflicting.
Yep.
So my question is, how consistent are the forecast models? How really consistent are they?
A model is only as good as how it was designed, because what a model does, I should say, is take the input or the weather information that will be ingested in it, and based on the dynamics in terms of what type of parameters are you going to be biased to. Because yes, the model is trying to do an overall picture, but some models might be skewed towards precipitation or rainfall, whereas some might be skewed towards temperature, some might be skewed towards pressure and so forth, waves and so forth.
Yeah.
So, and again, that's why I indicated that it's very important for you as the meteorologist or the forecaster to understand and to recognize and appreciate these different biases that the models may have. So yes, you're looking at it, but you're not taking it as gospel. You're taking it with a grain of salt or a pound of salt in some cases. For example, I know of some models, I only look at them for when I want to look at the winds, whereas other models, I put more confidence in them if I'm looking at a rainfall output, rainfall forecast. So understanding these inherent biases is very important. Also, in terms of the challenges and complexities, previously we used to just do the traditional weather forecast. What is the weather going to be like? And over the years, what we have been shifting towards is not just telling the general public what's the weather going to be like, but what's the weather going to be like and how is it going to be impacting your livelihoods, so that you now can make an informed decision in terms of do you need to adjust your way of life and so forth. So that is where we are going in terms of impact-based forecasting.
Right, and so therefore that impact-based forecasting relies a lot on
Human
your
aspect.
communication to the public.
Yes, it does.
How important is that for the Met Office?
Communication.
And who do you communicate this information to? Who's important, who gets it?
Yeah, communication is very important. And from a Met Office, we recognize that we have different degrees of end users. So yes, some of our information that we put out, we recognize that the general public is our end user. In other cases, it might be, as you indicated earlier, the farmers may be looking for a particular product from us. So we can put out a particular product that is targeting the farming community or the tourism sector and so forth. So based on the particular end user, then we can coin the message. Yes, we can have a general forecast in terms of what is the general condition, but at the same time, in terms of the products and services that we as an office can offer, we can tailor it to suit the end user.
So your relationship with, for example, media houses and key stakeholders, for example, like the National Emergency Management Agency,
Yes.
is key because they deal with disasters as well, but they are more into the preparation, being prepared, and all of that sort of a thing. So they will rely on you for weather forecast and data and so on.
Yes, they do. Because the NEMA especially, NEMA manages the whole apparatus in terms of the disaster apparatus. But the various institutions and agencies have their own response mechanism as well. And as such, we have to communicate not only to NEMA, but we have to find some way to communicate, whether to the media houses, because the media houses is an end user, because the general public is relying on the media houses to get information. At the present moment, we don't have a direct line to the general public. However, it is my hope that sometime in the future that we will be migrating back to that, where we have a more digital footprint, a social media footprint, so the general public, instead of having to rely on information coming through the media houses, they can just go, whether it be to a Facebook page, a website that is operated by us, because at the same time that allows us to update the information in real time and allows the general public to access the information.
Right, like we get the forecast, you know. For example, I can go online, for example, and I'm on my MSN account and I have it set to St. Kitts and I get the temperature and I get the forecast for St. Kitts and all of that. Now that is not coming from the local Met Office.
Right.
Correct.
That is coming from somewhere else. What do you have to say on in terms of that? Because on one hand, you're saying that we have to rely on the local Met Office for official information with respect to weather forecasting within the Federation. But on the other hand, how many of us really rely on weather forecasting from a lot of what we see? We have these apps now, a lot of these weather apps, AccuWeather, and there are so many of them. And I only have to type in St. Kitts, and they will give me the whole forecast for St. Kitts. So what are people really following? They're following those, or they're following you? And what do you have to say about that?
You find a lot of persons in the general public, they are following both. And what I always encourage persons to do, if you just want a general, broad description of what's the weather like, if you want, you can peep on those apps. It can give you a broad aspect, because you need to recognize that these institutions that generate those forecasts that you get on your apps, they're not doing localized weather conditions.
They're not, but some of the times they're accurate, because I used to have the weather. I have the Weather Channel app, and the Weather Channel app will tell me, for example, it's going to rain in the next 20 minutes. And sometimes it rains in the next 20 minutes.
Yes, and at the same time, what you have to recognize, it depends on the feature that is going to generate the weather condition. Because there are times that there are localized or small-scale features that these large institutions or agencies do not capture. So we, the local Met Office, or even the regional forecasting office in Antigua, we monitor these small fluxes. and as such our forecast would capture and reflect these small changes and so forth. But if it is a large feature, for example, if we anticipate rainfall across the entire federation, um, whether you go to one of those larger institutions, all of us gonna get it. That it's likely
Yes.
to rain.
Same thing.
But
Yeah,
if you now
but-
start to now go down on a smaller scale, because none of those apps will tell you straight up, it is gonna be raining in Fig Tree, Sandy Point at 12:01 versus 12:03, because the area is so small compared to what the grid scale that the models use. But if it is a large feature that covers the entire island or sometimes the entire northern Leeward Island, they can easily and confidently say that the chances of you getting rainfall during this time is high. And as such, that's what they use.
So do you think some of
It's
these
silly.
big, for example, these big weather companies and all of that sort of a thing are really challenging your relevancy in these small islands?
It pushes us to keep up to date and to indicate and to push above our threshold, because if we become complacent, then we become obsolete. So if we don't keep up with the time, if we don't evolve, then they're gonna be producing these large scale weather forecasts and try to say, okay, for a small island, this is what it's likely to be for you.
Right. Now, in terms of, for example, I'm coming from London on British Airways, for example, and just before coming into St. Kitts or coming on my halfway on my way, they will say the weather condition in St. Kitts is 77 degrees, 79 degrees, or whatever it is, and they will tell you what the weather is. Whose weather are they using? Are they using the weather from the local Met Office?
Yes.
Which weather they're using?
When you're looking at
yes.
in aviation,
In
they
aviation,
use the local Met
Met
Office
Office.
information.
First
So-
and foremost, there's no question
Yes.
the ifs and buts.
So what we do, there's an international hub which is based in Washington.
Right.
Via all Met Offices, we push our data into that hub, and it is then disseminated globally. So regardless of where you're coming from or where you're going, you can know what is the weather condition based on the Met Office
The
observation.
local Met
The
Offices.
local Met
That is
Offices. What is the condition at that particular time, at that particular place?
Okay.
And in aviation, that's a priority.
Okay.
There's no ifs and buts. It's how the rules are.
It's how the rules are.
That's correct.
Those are rules coming from the ICAO, ICAO,
ICAO.
It's an ICAO arrangement with WMO.
and WMO.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Now let us look at the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season.
What's that? Okay.
What is the forecast? What is the weather forecast? What is it, forecast to be like? And sometimes we have all these predictions, they're predictabilities, and for example, last year it was said that we were going to have a very active and we didn't get anything to really talk about. So let's just hear you, Elmo. And who
yes.
does this? Who does this weather forecasting? Because definitely it's not done from here. We don't do it
We
here.
don't do it locally. What you find is several universities who have large climate studies department. They are focused, for example, Colorado State University, Arizona State University, and even Florida State University. These universities have invested in terms of supercomputers to produce some of these climate forecasts, some of these, and so forth. One of the more reliable one of the more acceptable one, especially for us here in the sub-region, is the forecast emanating from the Colorado State University. And I guess it's because over the years we recognize that they have been more accurate and they provide the periodic updates and so forth. At the same time, you sent something a while ago that the forecast last year had called for a way above average season. However, we here in St. Kitts didn't get anything. The forecast was totally accurate because they never said that they are doing a forecast for St. Kitts and Nevis.
Correct.
They are doing it for the Atlantic Basin. So they're saying that within the Atlantic Basin, and we're talking about the entire Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, the U.S. coastline, in that region that we anticipate a hyperactive hurricane season in terms of hurricane activity, and as such it materialized. Where last year we had 30 storms, 14 of which develop into hurricanes and 6 develop into major hurricanes. For this year, they're looking at a lower number, and the reason that they're looking at a lower number because last year we had a strong La Nina, whereas this year we anticipate that as we go into the peak of the hurricane season, we're going to be experiencing a weak to moderate La Nina. And as such, we are anticipating 18 storms, 8 of which should develop or may develop into hurricane. And out of these 8 hurricanes, we're anticipating 4 may develop into major hurricanes. And when we say major hurricanes, we're talking about categories 3, 4, and 5. That doesn't mean that any of these 18 will impact us. At the same time, it doesn't mean all of these 18 might impact us. You know what I mean? So what the forecast does, it allows for the disaster fraternity, it allows for the insurance companies to start to mobilize resources. Because if you recognize there's a potential that you may be impacted, or there is a high potential, then you can now start to mobilize resources, preposition resources as well. So that is one of the main objective of the forecast.
Okay, so the categories of hurricanes, you have category 1, you have 2, you have 3, 4, and 5. And those categories are based on the Saffron-Simpson scale.
Correct.
Now, what importance do you give to those categories?
The Saffron-Simpson,
and what must people know in terms of these categories?
What we always tell persons, the higher up you go in the number, in terms of the Saffron-Simpson scale, is the more destructive the storm is likely to be.
Yes.
Because that's all we're telling you, based on the wind speed that the storm is expecting to reach, and then it is translated to a level of damage anticipated by that wind speed once it hit structures and so forth. So as you move from a category 1, you're looking at minor damage, some tree limbs broken and so forth. But when you now reach to a category 5, you're talking about widespread catastrophic impact and so forth. So you're talking about structural damage in terms of widespread. Over the years, a lot of persons have always postulated about the need to be a category 6, and especially from the 2017 I think season, when we had those monsters, where we had Irma, Maria, Jose. What persons need to recognize, the Saffron-Simpson scale is not just the wind information. They are correlating the wind with what is the potential level of damage. So if you have widespread catastrophic damage, there's nothing more than that. That's the furthest, in terms of from a descriptive point of view, that's the furthest you go. So at this moment, that is where it is widespread catastrophic. So you know there will be most likely significant loss of life, significant infrastructural damage as well. So
and hurricanes are fed by convectional activity. The heating up of the oceans and the evaporation that takes place, and later on the formation of clouds and the condensation and all of that sort of a thing. How has the climate over time affected the intensity, the severity of the storms that we are getting? Because at one point I never used to hear all of these named storms. In fact, last year they ran out of names. They had to go to the Greek. They had not make up. They went to the Greek alphabet.
Yes.
Alpha, beta, gamma, whatever
Yes,
those
they
things.
did it.
That was
Kappa.
the second time in history that we used the Greek letters.
Mhm.
One of the main drivers for tropical cyclone formation is what we call the water heat content. Is a storm need a deep layer of warm water, ocean warm water. So what we're now finding is the ocean is warmer and at a deeper level. So whenever you have a tropical cyclone passing over that area, even though you have a little bit of upwelling, it allows sufficient extra heat behind that if a next system come across, it can upwell it and feed off of it. And as such, you're now seeing these monster storms and more storms forming.
Right. Okay, so the warming of the ocean,
That's one
the
of the
main,
main
the
drivers.
main thing, and it's creating basically more convectional activity.
Yes.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the belly of the thing.
It's the belly of
Belly
the
of
thing,
the
really,
animal.
because that is how it is really fed.
Yeah.
Now, when storms are they more intense? They're more intense at sea than when they're over land. They lose pressure. What goes on?
Dynamically,
the jury is out on that one.
Dynamically, a storm, because it feeds from the water heat content over the ocean. So if you have warm water over from the ocean, then you expect it to be able to sustain. But then you have to now factor in what is happening in the upper atmosphere. You're going to have shear rain. Do you have counter effects and so forth? When you now come over land, what you anticipate you're going to have is a level of friction. Also, you're moving away from the heat engine. However, some studies have shown that although you move over land, if you have sufficiently moist land that is warm to a particular depth, it can sustain a cyclone. So whereas you expect, I remember Tropical Storm Erin in 2007, when it moved over the Everglades. Most persons expected it to dissipate.
Yeah.
However, it maintained its strength, and it actually strengthened as it moved into those warm, moist coastal areas. And I did some research on that, and it's because you had similar thing, that it was similar to the water heat content of the ocean.
Now,
And it had a great expanse of land, so you know it had time to regenerate and reorganize itself.
now, have these storms been given names as yet?
What we do, there's some names designated. Every 6 years, WMO designate a cycle of storm names. So for the next 6 years, the names have already been issued. And they have
Right, so the
already been
names for
publicized.
this year
have
They're
already
there.
been published.
have already been. You don't have a list of it here,
No, I
but
don't. But I can
You
provide
can
it.
pull
to
it
you.
up.
okay.
Also, the names have already been provided for the, as I said, for the next 6 years. So out towards up to next 2025, the names have already been published.
And what process do they go about naming these storms? Is it just random? Is it just random? The random naming? I've never heard one called Lesroy.
And be happy.
We have to put one.
We're happy that we don't have a hurricane Leslie coming our way.
We can put less oil.
But one thing, it's a committee. So you'll find all the WMO members, especially for the sub-region, they will normally come together and agree on what are the names that they want to have for the cycle.
So there are English names, I realize, and there are a lot of
Spanish,
Spanish names,
yes.
Spanish names as well. Even La Nina and El Nino, those are Spanish names, boy and girl.
Yes.
You know, so,
But in relation to the storm names, and the reason you have a whole group of persons coming together, because some names may have a level of connotation and sensitivity in certain culture. So because of that, some countries object vehemently to certain names. So certain names will never ever be used because it is offensive
I see.
in a particular culture. On the flip side, once the names have been identified and agreed to by the entire grouping, once a storm is severe, whether it be catastrophic, whether loss of life or damage, infrastructure damage, every year the Hurricane Committee meeting, which is for the Region 4, which is the Americas, they will decide whether or not to retire a particular name. And each country have the option to put forward based on the level of destruction that they might have experienced and so forth, whether they want this name to be retired, and it is voted on. So it's a democratic process.
Okay.
And in the Far East, they've had more rejections than any one of the other regions, again because of their cultural issues.
Yes.
And so on.
Names,
But
yes.
you notice their names are different too.
Right.
As well, so
Right.
they're more contentious
Right.
in that particular. I was reading some of the articles
Okay.
that came out of the debates.
Okay.
Interesting.
Now we have looked at the then, in terms of the meteorological office. We've looked at the now. We looked at that. I mean, you know what was there from way back, Mr. John.
Day one.
Day one. Elmo is now more the current person and the new
Yes.
person. You dealt with the analog and all of that sort of a thing.
Yes.
He's dealing more with the digital and being more tech savvy and so on. But what are some of the, after 50 years, what do you envisage the future of the Met Office to be? What are some of the things that you would like to see? Some of the changes, some of the innovation?
I would like to see a change in terms of, from a policy point of view, because over the past 50 years, persons may be surprised to hear that there was never a legislation establishing the Met Services. So we have been operating without legislation.
Well, we've
because
operated
you remember
on our British
yes,
system that we had inherited, and we just used it and has not given any thought to legislation.
Yeah, so there hasn't been any local
Right.
legislation, because you remember a legislation would guide you in terms of what are your core mandate, what are your responsibilities,
Right.
what are your resources that you would need, and so forth, as well as your reporting mechanisms and so forth. So that is something that we are actively engaged in at the moment, where the CMO has been leading a regional project where some of the member states are participating in terms of a draft model legislation. We have been in the advanced stage. So once we have finalized that, CMO will be sharing it with the participating member states so that they can take it to their cabinet for further review and action. So that will kind of guide us in terms of our policy framework going forward. In terms of from an institutional perspective, I've always envisioned that I would love to see the Sencus and the Nevis Met become one. That's one thing. Because regionally, nobody think of us as two Met services. They look at us as two offices, but there is one Met service. So we need to regularize that. Also,
Legislation again.
over the next 5 to 10 years, and you have to hope, you have to plan. It is always my dream that sooner or later that we develop the capacity to do our local forecasts, so that we can be less reliant on Antigua and Barbuda. We have started making, in terms of a concerted effort towards that approach. Yes, we are not there, we are nowhere close to there as yet, but what we have started to do is we have started to now put the training involved in terms of the capacity development for the staff in place, if we want to do that shift. So those are some of the things that we are looking at. Also in terms of communication, because developing all these forecasts but not communicating it effectively to our end users is another issue. So I would like to have a social media footprint, as well as one cry that we have always been hearing over the past few years, especially from the media houses. They would love that, since we are the authoritative voice, that instead of they present the weather information, a lot of them would prefer that the Met Office be the one who would be putting forward a package. So we do the actual broadcast and we share it with them for
Yes,
dissemination.
and I would like to see, for example, you come up on, you give the live weather forecast on ZIZ, and you have all of these, you know,
The
like
graphics.
the graphics and so on that sometimes you see on cable TV. I thought that, so you have Elmer Burke coming and giving the weather report, and he can point this out, and then the map is there, and he can explain this and so on as the Met officer.
Yes.
I think that would be
So-
something, you know, interactive. It is very interactive.
So that is one of my main gym, and I've already indicated to most of the staff that eventually that is where I would love to take the Met Office.
Yes.
With the permission of the management and so forth, that we take it. That what we have to do is ensure that we have persons trained to do and deliver the information. So we are now doing that component. So whether I'm there or not, I'm trying to lay the groundwork
Okay.
for that shift.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Burke, we are out of time. How many trained Met officers do you have in St. Kitts?
Currently in St. Kitts we have 9 Met officers. 8 of us are fully trained. We have one, he's just awaiting certification. That should be done sometime soon. And out of these 8, so all of us are at the observer level, including myself, because that's the basic. Out of that, as I indicated before, we now have 2 persons who have the advanced level, or
Yes.
one of them are trained in instrumentation, whereas the other is in climatology, and I have a next member of staff who is currently doing climatology at that
Okay.
level.
So you're only at the observing level?
We're at the observing level, but some of us in the institution have the advanced. For example, myself, I am a meteorologist, so I have the degree, and I'm also operational forecaster.
Okay.
And I have one other officer who is also an operational forecaster, and another one who just started, who is going to be starting it just next month to do his operational forecasting.
One just finished his degree?
Yes, please.
Mhm.
So he's
Okay.
going to be moving into operational forecasts.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, we're out of time. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we leave?
We would just like to thank all those who would have extended congratulatory remarks to the Met Services on our 50th anniversary, recognizing 50 years of contribution to nation building is not an easy feat. We would have gotten a lot of licks over the years, but guess what? We're still standing still because we recognize that persons' lives and livelihoods are dependent on us improving, and as such we have adopted the approach that we want to be continuously improving our services and the way that we deliver the information to the general public. We also want to reassure the general public that we have their back. We're going to be reliable and accurate, and as such that's why we coined our theme for this year's 50th anniversary. So just want to thank everybody for the congratulatory messages. Thank the staff and management of the Met Services, as well as CASPA and the ministry, for their support over the years, as well as all our key stakeholders, because without your critical constructive criticisms, we will just be stagnant. So over the years we have grown because you have told us what you would like to see from us, and we have tried to deliver on that.
Right.
So thank you for that.
Right. Mr. John, is there anything you would like to say before we leave? You're a veteran at this business.
principally to be proud of what has started out of an initiative that I think government back then foresaw the way of moving something forward. And when the governments of the Caribbean got together and decided on isolating the Met services and the air traffic services and so on, at that time was a good move. I happen to be fortunate to be in the path of that progressiveness. And I have looked back on it now for 50 years. We're going to have, what, 22 Met officers?
Yes,
Thereabout, over the years. 22 in 50 years, I thought we've done extremely well. What I would love to see, however, is maybe from a regional standpoint, that we look at people like Elmo and have our own sort of module-based research center as part of the OACS and so on, where we can actually put places of equal pressure together and look at modules that we can actually design from a Caribbean perspective in terms of forecasting than using all the American and British model and whatever models, because we too need that exposure. We too need to get that expertise harnessed so we can improve our own services in the future. Mm-hmm. That's what I would like to see.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Burke, and thank you to Mr. John. The then, the now, and of course the future. And we've had that discussion here this afternoon. And thank you so much. It has really been a pleasure having both of you on this program. It's very rare that you're here, but for your 50th anniversary, it is so important. And I want to wish you all the best going forward into the future, because you play an important role in weather forecasting, because people's lives and people's livelihoods are impacted by it and are dependent upon it. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of our listeners to today's program. You are, of course, appreciated from week to week. Next week, we will be back with another edition of Working for You. Until then, I am Les Roy Williams. Take care.